couple in Golden scammed out of nearly $140,000 through a sophisticated phishing scam. By the time a Jefferson County man realized that the Chase Bank fraud team that he was talking to was actually the scammers themselves.
Scott and Kate Soule had built their lives carefully. Scott ran a business with partners in Golden, Colorado. Kate worked steadily beside him. Together, they had saved over the years. Money intended not just for today, but for the decades ahead. They banked with Chase, paid bills on time, and managed their accounts the way millions of Americans do, responsibly, routinely, without drama. On the morning of January 12, 2024, Scott's phone received a text message. It appeared to come from Chase Alerts. The message read, "Did you attempt to send a wire transfer for the amount of $4,500? Reply wire in." Scott had not initiated any wire transfer. Before responding, he contacted his business partners to confirm. None of them had authorized the transaction either. At that point, Scott did what most people would do. He called his local Chase Bank branch to report the suspicious activity. The branch employee gave him a phone number for Chase's fraud department. Scott wrote it down. He then replied to the text message, stating that he had not authorized the wire. Within seconds, he received another text. Someone from the Chase fraud team would be contacting him shortly. Less than 30 seconds later, his phone rang. The number on the caller ID matched the one the bank branch had just provided. Scott answered. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and informed. The representative identified themselves as part of Chase's fraud prevention team. They acknowledged the suspicious wire transfer. They asked Scott to verify his identity using standard security questions. They explained what they were seeing on their end. They used the language Scott had heard before in legitimate calls with his bank. Everything about the conversation felt correct. The representative mentioned that the call was being recorded for quality assurance. They referenced Scott's account balance. They knew details about his business account and his personal account. They walked him through the steps Chase would take to block the fraudulent wire and secure his accounts. Scott had used remote banking tools before. He had spoken with fraud departments in the past. He understood that banks monitored suspicious activity and reached out to customers when something appeared irregular. This call aligned with every prior experience he had ever had with financial institutions. At one point during the conversation, the call dropped. Scott, now concerned that he had lost contact with the fraud team, dialed the Chase fraud line himself. When he reached an actual Chase representative, they could not see the case or the conversation he had been having moments earlier. Scott grew frustrated. Within a minute, the original caller, the one he believed was from Chase, called back. Scott returned to that line, relieved that the person who seemed to understand his situation was still available. The representatives on the phone told Scott that the threat to his accounts was more serious than initially believed. They explained that hackers had gained access to his banking credentials and were actively attempting to drain his accounts. They informed him that multiple unauthorized wire transfers were being initiated in real time. The amounts were significant. The destinations were overseas. If Scott did not act immediately, the money would be gone. Scott was shown, or told about, account activity that suggested large sums were already in transit. The representatives explained that the only way to stop the transfers and secure the funds was to move the money to protected accounts temporarily. They would guide him through the process. Time was critical. Scott did not perceive this as sending money to strangers. He perceived it as relocating his own funds to prevent theft. The representatives framed each wire transfer as a defensive action, not a payment. They reassured him that once the threat was neutralized, the funds would be returned to his accounts. They used terminology that sounded procedural, account safeguarding, fraud mitigation, temporary holding accounts. Scott followed their instructions. He initiated wire transfers from both his business account and his personal account. The representative stayed on the line with him, providing step-by-step guidance. They told him what to say if the bank asked questions. They coached him on how to describe the purpose of the wires. They maintained a tone of urgency without shouting, creating the impression that hesitation would result in permanent loss. In total, 11 wire transfers were executed. 9 came from Scott's business accounts. 2 came from the personal account he shared with Kate. The amounts ranged across the transactions, but together they totaled $137,030.
So there were 11 wire transfers in total, 2 on our personal accounts, 9 on our business accounts. We lost close to $140,000.
The destinations were financial institutions in locations far from Colorado. The wires were processed as legitimate, authorized transactions, because Scott himself had initiated them, believing he was protecting his money. Only one of the 11 transfers triggered a fraud alert from Chase's automated system. That alert appeared as a text message on January 12, stating that if the bank did not hear from Scott by January 18, the wire would be canceled. Scott assumed the alert meant the bank had recognized the fraud and would stop the transfer. He had already reported the scam on January 13, the day after it occurred. He believed the system was working. The wire went through anyway, along with all the others. Kate Zoll became aware of the situation when Scott told her what had happened. At first, there was confusion. Then came the slow, sinking understanding that the people on the phone had not been from Chase Bank. The account balances confirmed it. The money was gone. Kate later described the feeling as living inside a nightmare that repeated every morning. Scott described it as a violation that went beyond the financial loss.
Every day we just wake up and feel like we're living kind of a nightmare right now.
They had been made to participate in their own theft. They had been convinced to hand over money they had worked years to accumulate, believing they were saving it. There was no dramatic moment of discovery, no confrontation, just the quiet, crushing realization that the voice on the phone had been a performance, and that the performance had been flawless. Scott and Kate reported the fraud to Chase Bank on January 13, the day after the scam. They expected immediate action. What followed was a series of transfers between departments, fraud claims, wire recovery, technical support, local branch staff. Each department had limited visibility into the other's activities. Kate described the experience as being punted from one team to the next, with no single person able to see the full picture. It took 11 days for the couple to be assigned a case manager. That assignment came after a local news outlet, Fox 31, made inquiries to Chase Bank on the couple's behalf. Prior to that, Scott and Kate had been navigating the bank's internal systems on their own, with no clear sense of whether their case was being actively investigated or simply logged. Chase Bank informed them that wire transfers, once sent, are treated as final payments. The bank's ability to recover the funds depended on cooperation from the 4 financial institutions that had received the wires. Those institutions had 60 to 90 days to respond. If the money had already moved overseas, the likelihood of recovery was minimal. Chase also told the couple that their fraud claims had been denied. The wire transfers had been authorized by Scott himself. From the bank's perspective, the transactions were legitimate. The fact that Scott had been deceived did not change the technical reality. He had provided the one-time passcodes, initiated the wires, and answered the security questions. The couple later learned, through further investigation by Chase, that Scott's personal computer had been infected with malware 13 months earlier. The malware may have allowed the scammers to access his banking information, account balances, and transaction history long before the phone call ever took place. The Zolls case sits in a space where legal responsibility is unclear. Scott provided the authentication codes that allowed the transfers to proceed. He responded to prompts, answered questions, and completed the transactions himself. The scammers never touched his computer or his bank account directly. They simply convinced him to do it. Chase Bank's fraud detection system did not stop the transfers in real time. The couple had never wired money in all their years of banking with Chase. The sudden execution of 11 wires to unfamiliar institutions, draining both personal and business accounts, did not trigger a halt or a manual review. Only one of the 11 was flagged, and even that flag was processed as a delayed alert rather than an immediate block. Legal experts who analyze these cases note that wire fraud victims often have limited recourse. Unlike credit card fraud, where protections exist for unauthorized charges, wire transfers operate under different rules. Once the sender authorizes the transaction, the bank is generally not liable for recovery. The burden falls on the victim to prove they were coerced or that the bank failed in its duty to detect obvious fraud patterns. The FBI documented 405 phishing victims in Colorado in 2022, with losses nearing $500,000. Another 467 spoofing victims lost over $2 million. Supervisory Special Agent Brian Blauser, based in Denver, confirmed that the technology used to spoof phone numbers is widely available and increasingly sophisticated. Scammers can make a call appear to come from any number, including that of a bank's fraud department. They can script conversations so precisely that victims believe they are speaking with trained professionals. The question that remains unanswered is whether financial institutions bear responsibility for failing to recognize patterns that should, in hindsight, appear obvious. On January 31st, nearly 3 weeks after the scam, Kate received a call from a Chase case manager. The bank believed a significant portion of the funds would be recovered, though not all. The recovery was not guaranteed. The timeline was uncertain. The couple was told to wait. Scott returned to work. Kate returned to her routines. They changed passwords, closed accounts, reissued credit cards, and rebuilt the digital infrastructure of their financial lives. The work of recovery was invisible and exhausting. The money they lost was not extra. It was not inheritance or windfall. It was the product of decades of labor, saved for the years when work would no longer be an option.
I have to work 10 times harder than I was working, to get back to where I was, not even ahead, just to get back to where we were.
The loss was not abstract. It was real, and it was permanent in ways that went beyond the dollar amount. Kate said they would find money again. She said they would show their children how to move forward. But she also said this, that every morning they woke up and had to accept that the money was gone and that the people who took it would never be held accountable.
And start all over again to try to accept that all our money's gone. And I'm not hopeful at this point in the journey that we're going to see any of it again.
The scam succeeded not because the Zolls were careless, but because the system they trusted, built on caller ID, one-time passcodes, and the assumption that a bank's phone number means a bank is calling, was designed without considering that trust itself could be weaponized. There is no resolution to this story. Only the question of whether the next person will recognize the script before it is too late.